The forest of Black Hollow had a silence that was almost unnatural. Trees stood like sentinels, their gnarled branches twisting into shapes too strange to be natural. The lake, once a popular place for scouts to swim, now seemed to hold a deep, lifeless stillness. And the camp itself, which had been abandoned for decades, stood as a hushed testament to something far worse than mere neglect. The group of scouts stood at the edge of the camp, their eyes flickering uneasily between the rundown cabins and the overgrown paths leading into the woods. They'd been told it was haunted, a place where scouts had disappeared, leaving only their whispers behind. But those were just stories, right? Tales to send shivers down the spines of the younger kids. They were older now, capable of handling anything the wilderness could throw at them. The scoutmaster, a well-meaning but green instructor named Mr. Thomas, smiled at them, his enthusiasm barely masking the tension in his shoulders. He had only recently taken charge of the troop and wanted to prove to everyone, including himself, that he was more than ready for this challenge. "All right, everyone," Mr. Thomas called, "let's get to work. We'll prove those old legends are just that, legends." As night fell and the group gathered around the fire, a sudden gust of wind swept through the clearing, bending the trees and rattling the leaves. The fire flickered and dimmed, casting long, erratic shadows. One scout, Thomas's oldest and most dependable, Caleb, stared into the forest, his gaze fixed on something deep within. "I don't know, guys," Caleb muttered, rubbing his arms. "It feels wrong out here." The others laughed, but Caleb's unease spread slowly through the group. They tried to push it aside, to focus on their plans for the next day, but the air was heavy with something unsaid. Their voices were too loud, too forced, as if they were trying to fill the silence with confidence. That night, after the campfire had died down and the scouts retreated to their tents, Caleb couldn't sleep. He could feel something watching him. He wasn't sure what it was, but the unease he felt earlier had turned into a palpable presence, like fingers brushing against the back of his neck. In the stillness of the night, he heard it, a faint whisper, barely more than the wind. A name is name. He froze, wide-eyed, but when he turned to look, the forest remained still, untouched. But the whispers didn't stop. They became clearer, repeating louder until the sound filled his mind. The voices were no longer distant. They were inside his head, echoing memories of things he couldn't place. A story about a scout who had gone missing, a scout who had been called by a voice in the woods, a scout who had never returned. And then Caleb saw it. In the shadows between the trees, a figure stood, not moving, just watching. It was too dark to make out any features, but Caleb knew with a certainty that chilled him to the core that it was not human. He tried to scream but found his voice stolen. The figure took a step forward, then another, until it was just beyond the trees, so close that he could hear the rustle of its presence. The next morning, Caleb was missing. The others assumed he had wandered off, seeking adventure or some personal time. But as the day wore on, the unease spread. The group searched the camp, the nearby trails, and the surrounding woods, but there was no sign of Caleb. Tension began to grow between the scouts. Every rustle in the trees, every distant howl, felt like it could be a part of Caleb's disappearance, or worse, an omen. Each scout began having unsettling dreams. Lillian, the troop's best navigator, woke up one night, convinced she had seen Caleb standing by her tent, his eyes hollow and empty, but when she stepped outside, there was no trace of him. "He's out there," Lillian whispered one evening, her face pale. "I saw him. I swear I saw him." Mr. Thomas, increasingly agitated, tried to calm the group, dismissing the strange occurrences as nothing more than stress and fear of the unknown. But his efforts grew more desperate and the darkness of the camp seemed to press in on them. Each scout, as the days passed, began to act more erratically. They became paranoid, distrustful of one another. Someone had to be behind Caleb's disappearance, they reasoned. Someone had to know something, but they couldn't be sure who. They were alone. The stories about Black Hollow weren't just stories. They were truths, dark truths that had been buried long ago. And those truths had come alive again, searching for new souls to claim. The night the storm hit was the night everything changed. The winds howled like voices from the past, the trees bending at unnatural angles. Then, there were the noises. Twigs snapping, low growls in the dark, and something else, something that sounded like whispers. It was then that Mr. Thomas realized what he had failed to understand. Black Hollow wasn't just haunted. It was alive, feeding on fear, drawing in those who sought to conquer it, only to have them lost in its eternal grasp. One by one, the scouts were taken, their screams swallowed by the night, leaving only the wind to carry their voices into the forest. As the last scout, Lillian, stood alone in the clearing, her eyes wide with terror, she heard the faintest whisper her name, calling her into the woods. She hesitated, but the pull of the voices was too strong. And in that moment, she knew there were no survivors of Black Hollow. If you like this story, and for more dark stories, please hit the like button and subscribe to my channel. See ya!